We're in 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3. And when you get to 3, the very first sentence sends you back. It's not a therefore statement, but it says, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. The in the same way refers back to a couple of things that he's already discussed. Since we've been apart for so long, let me just take a minute to remind us what the letter is all about. You've got a bunch of folks, mainly Jewish believers, who have been run out of Jerusalem because of the persecution. And Peter and the other apostles in Jerusalem are trying to shepherd these people as best they can from a distance. And so James sends them a letter. We're familiar with the letter of James. Peter sends a couple of letters to them. Probably, well, there's a list in the beginning of the letter to Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, which, when you think about where Paul went on that first missionary journey, he and Barnabas, that's the eastern side of that area. And then places like Corinth would be way down to the south in Achaia, and then Bithynia and Asia Minor are all up kind of in that middle part of that section between Philippi and where Paul grew up in Tarsus. There's just a big, long stretch of area where the missionary work happened in those first few years. But a lot of the folks that left Jerusalem ended up living in those places. And so Peter's trying to encourage them, trying to tell them how they ought to live, because they're under such scrutiny from not just government officials, but from their neighbors and employers and, all kinds of people that they were in contact with, to try to figure out how they should handle themselves as Christians in a very difficult situation. So run back over to chapter 2 and look at verse 18. Okay. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. It's commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. And he goes on down and talks about how Christ was insulted and abused, but he gave himself over to them because he wanted to be the shepherd of the sheep, right? So Peter is writing to the scattered sheep, and he says, you've got to try to imitate your shepherd who was willing to go through suffering or whatever it took so that other people could find salvation. And then he says, wives, in the same way. So in the same way refers back to those who were in slavery, whether you've got a good boss or a bad boss, a good owner or a bad owner. It refers back to those individuals who were in that situation. You say, well, in our generation, saying, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands is tough enough. But then to say, well, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands in the same way that slaves submit themselves to their masters, that's a huge statement. Well, the difference, at least to some degree, is that a lot of these women didn't pick who they were married to. And a lot of these women had been converted after they were married. So you've got different categories of women. Some women were probably very happy with their marriage and didn't mind having some kind of relationship with their husband where they were in submission to their husband because their husbands weren't harsh or hateful, and it went along very well. But some of these women were married to pagans, were married to people who were harsh with them, were hateful to them. And so in the same way that slaves were called to be obedient even to masters who weren't very nice, wives were called to be obedient to husbands who weren't very nice. And there wasn't a great deal that these women could do about their situation. It was much more difficult for them to get rid of a husband that was abusive to them than it was for the husband to get rid of the wife. So wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husband. And the reason, again, is because we want more people to be saved, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So what we have envisioned here is a husband who is not a Christian. We're not talking about a lovely Christian family where the husband and wife are working together to serve the Lord. We're talking about a wife who is a Christian and a husband who is not. And the wife is to live in such a way that her husband will respect her and care about her opinion when it comes to matters of salvation. If the wife is rebellious and the husband is constantly having to squelch her to keep her under control, so to speak, then he's not going to want to hear anything she's got to say. But Peter says that these men could be won without a word if they had not been obedient to the word. So perhaps they've heard the gospel preached, or they've been around people who are believers, at least their wives, who have talked about their relationship with Christ, but they're not believers. Well, if the word of God isn't enough, what else do you have to offer them? He says, well, your behavior may change their attitude towards salvation. They may change their mind about Jesus because they see that being part of the family of God has made you a better woman. So if you're a good woman and they see that, then they might want to say, well, why is she such a good woman? Well, she's a Christian and her Christianity is a good thing. If you're vile to your husband and you fight back against whatever authority he's trying to put on you, then he's not going to see Christianity as a good thing. And that was a difficult thing for first century Christians because there was a lot of talk about being free in Christ. And Paul says, well, don't let your freedom give you a license to sin. Don't let your freedom just turn you into somebody who lives any way you want to live. So here Peter says this to the wives, to be in submission to your husbands. Maybe, if they don't believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Then he gives them beauty tips, and it's always wonderful for a guy to tell a woman beauty tips, but Peter's got this figured out. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, the wearing of gold jewelry, or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. This is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. So to imagine themselves in the place of Sarah would have been something that Jewish women would have thought was a great idea. So if we're going to be like Sarah, what was it about Sarah that we admire? What was it that she did, or what image did she put forward that's worthy of us following? Well, when you read the Old Testament, do you ever see anything about Sarah being well-dressed? That's never emphasized. Read all through Genesis and the accounts of Abraham and Sarah. You never see any mention of what kind of clothing she wore or the kind of jewelry she might have had. Now, Abraham was a rich guy, so she probably had all kinds of stuff at her disposal, but that wasn't what was important. So as a Jewish woman, if you're looking back at Sarah, what you see is a woman who's willing to be submissive to her husband. So it wasn't about what you're wearing, and it wasn't about what kind of jewelry you had on, outward adornment. It was about the inner beauty. And so, we could talk about inner beauty all we want. I think all of us realize that in our culture, we overemphasize what we look like, both male and female. But I think we put more of a stigma on females and how they look and what they wear. And maybe you could even go back to Barbies. You've got to dress them up just right. And there's 100 different outfits you can buy for the Barbie doll, but none of them are relaxed. There's you're looking for beauty, and you get beauty, beauty shop Barbie, and you get all of the things that tell a young girl what you really want to do is look good. It's all about how you look. And I had a list of things at one time. I think I must have set it aside before I got here. That it was the cover of a Vogue magazine, and all of the articles that were in Vogue magazine and Cosmopolitan magazine that month. How to be, the right kind of woman. And imagine from Cosmopolitan magazine how many articles were about inner beauty. It was just zero. There was no emphasis on the inner beauty of the woman. It was all about what you put on, what surgery you can have to fix this or that ailment that you have with your body, getting everything just right so that somebody else can look at the outward appearance. And Peter warns these Jewish ladies, if you really want to be like Sarah, if you want to be like the women of old, the heroes that you grew up admiring, don't worry so much about the outward appearance. Worry about the inward. And you can throw along with this, I don't think I've ever seen anywhere in the New Testament that emphasizes dressing up for worship. I know of at least 2 or 3 that talk about the problem of some people dressing up and then looking down at those who don't dress as well. So, all the time I grew up, obviously we want to put our best foot forward, but there was a stigma for those who didn't dress well and then came to the assembly. What would Peter say to those people? Fix the inside first. Make sure that what's going on in your inner person is more important than the outer self. And, a lot of times when the inner is fixed, the outer takes care of itself. But if you just keep trying to fix the outer, sometimes the inner gets left behind. So Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord, you are her daughters if you do what is right and don't give way to fear. When did Sarah call Abraham her Lord? This is not this is the nth degree, right? Peter is talking to slaves. Even if your master beats you, just make sure you didn't deserve it. Hold up under suffering because that's like Jesus. Then he turns to the woman and he says, if you got a husband that's harsh to you, present him with that chaste lifestyle. And maybe without a word, he can be won by the attitude, by the lifestyle of his wife. But then he talks about Sarah calling Abraham Lord. So when did Sarah call Abraham Lord? When he gave her away to Pharaoh. Tell them you're my sister. Don't even admit that you're my wife. So he gives his wife away, and she's obedient to that. So Peter's saying to these women, the absolute wildest imagination of what a husband might do, Abraham did, and Sarah was faithful. So no, we don't want slavery. No, we don't want abusive husbands. No, wives should not be subjected to living in situations like some of these women were subjected to. But Peter says, even if you are, there is a way that you can continue to have an influence on the life of your husband, even though he may not be treating you as you ought to be treated. Okay? So you get 6 verses for what the women should do. How many verses do you get for the husbands? Just 1. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. There's a clause on this one. The wives are being subject so that they might win their husbands. If you've got a husband who is, you're almost going to assume that if the husband was a Christian, the wife was too in that era, because for the most part, the head of the household decided the religion, not only for his spouse, but for the children and for the servants and for anybody else that might be a part of their household. It would be a household-wide thing. So you could imagine a woman being a Christian and her husband not being, But if the husband is a Christian, more than likely the wife is. And he says, give her respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you. So probably we're talking about a husband whose wife is a Christian. And I guess the veiled threat is, if you don't treat your wife with respect, don't expect God to listen to your prayers. So if you can't show respect to the wife that he's given you and the co-heir of the promise of Christ, then when you go to the Father in prayer, just understand that you're acting in such a way that it's going to hinder your prayer life. Does anybody have a problem with the concept of women being the weaker partner?
I think that's wrong.
Okay?
Lord, I ain't never seen no weak woman yet.
I thought you said when God put them together, you become one.
There you go. You become one.
You become one. You know, no head, no tails.
It was widely accepted in that generation, and really in my generation growing up, that women are the weaker sex. Now, you're going to have to define weakness when you go to talking about childbirth and all kinds of other things that men don't want to have any part of. But the leadership of the family has always been, from Adam all the way forward, left up to the man. It is his responsibility to spiritually lead and nurture his family. Whenever that responsibility is passed from the male to the female, from the husband, the outcome is usually catastrophic. When you look at the number who remain faithful, if their father does not, the odds drop dramatically. So that if you have, I don't remember the exact totals, but I'll just give you a general idea. If the husband and wife are both faithful in their attendance and in their Christianity, the number is somewhere around 85% of the children will remain faithful. If the father is faithful and the mother is not, it only drops by a few percentage points, maybe into the upper 60s. If the mother is faithful and the father is not, it drops into the 30s. The leadership of the male spiritually in the family, you can't overestimate it. It's extremely important. And so perhaps from that viewpoint, through that lens, the idea of the husband being the leading partner in the relationship is just as important now as it was back then.
Well, even physically, men have more muscles than women.
That's a fact. And without getting into the politics of the thing, the recent changes allowing some men to participate in women's sports have been catastrophic. People, women with broken skulls and, all kinds of things. It's a bad thing. So it really is. So finally, verse 8, all of you. Right, so we've got the Christians living as citizens in a pagan society. We've got Christians living as slaves. We've got Christians living in mixed marriages where one is a Christian and the other is not. We've got husbands spiritually in their families. And then finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love each other, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil for evil or insult for insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. Again, he keeps going back to this idea of being called to a particular lifestyle. We're called to follow the example of Christ. We're called to love each other. And when you see love in action, it changes the atmosphere around you. So citizens who are living Christ-like lives have an influence on their culture. And slaves who are living a Christ-like life have effects on their owners. And wives who are living Christ-like lives have an effect on their husbands. Husbands who are leading in a godly way have an effect on society, on their families. You can make a difference. This is what you were called to do. So Peter says, I don't care if you're in Jerusalem and worshiping with the church where you were baptized, or where you were originally began following Christ, or whether you've had to run away and live in some place you've never been, or maybe you were from there and came and were converted at Jerusalem and moved back to Cappadocia and now you're just away from any kind of real strength in the church, you're still called to live a particular kind of lifestyle. And as long as you keep living that life, you can make a difference. When you just assimilate and become part of the culture, then you lose whatever influence you might have had. In verse 10, he quotes from one of the Psalms, Psalm 34. Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. Because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So David writes a lot of couplets in the Psalms like this that describe what it's like to live as the called, to live that life that God has called us to live, the blessings that we can expect. And then he go to the other end and say, but you know, if you live a life of evil, if you let yourself just assimilate to the culture, don't expect God to continue with those blessings and to still be on your side. You've got to decide, am I going to live the way I was called to live, or am I going to give that up and just fade back into the culture? So we'll leave it right there, and Lord willing, we'll pick up with 13 next Wednesday. Anybody have any thoughts? Anything you want to add? Nope. Okay. Well, bye, y'all. See you later.